As of the time I'm filming this, the Ninjago movie is going to turn 8 years old this month, and honestly, the fact that it is that old is really scary to think about. But the thing that makes it interesting is the fact that the Ninjago movie has had a lot of interesting opinions over the years, and to this day, it is still a widely debated topic over whether or not the movie is actually good or not. And I honestly think it is a very important and very interesting question, and I would love to know what you think of the Ninjago movie. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Has your opinion changed over the years? Because I do think it's something that a lot of people have been thinking about since the movie released, and as someone who has watched it more times than I'm willing to admit, I can definitely say my opinion has changed over time. So for this video, I am going to go over all aspects of the Ninjago movie, talk about all the different aspects that went into it, and answer the begging question of, is it still good 8 years later? Does it hold up? Is it honestly got a place within the Ninjago community? And is it just something that is worth going back to at this day and age? Because the time of the movie is certainly past, and we are going to get a live action Ninjago movie anyways. But the thing is that is this original movie that everyone really wanted back in the day something that is still worth it for the new fans? So let's provide some important context. The LEGO Ninjago movie was released in 2017, and it was the third installment in Warner Bros. LEGO universe. It followed up the LEGO movie and the LEGO Batman movie, and it was teased in the LEGO movie itself, as Lloyd Garmadon did make an appearance, and there was an additional promotional media called Meet the Ninja. So a Ninjago movie was always set when they were making this new universe. It was written by the same people who were writing Ninjago at the time, which was the Hageman brothers, and this was their full attempt at writing a standalone Ninjago movie, as they always said it was never going to interact with the show at all, as it was aimed at bringing in more fans to Ninjago. And to get that part out of the way, I do think it was fairly successful at that feat. I do think a lot of people were introduced to Ninjago because of the existence of the movie, so in that regard, it was definitely successful for that instance. But there was definitely a very high expectation when it did come to the Ninjago movie, because even though it was bringing in a whole load of new fans, a lot of the older fans at the time were definitely having high expectations. At this point in time, Ninjago was fairly seamless. Obviously, we were just off of the back of Season 7, and which a lot of people didn't really care for, but for the most part, people were expecting a very solid movie when it came to it. Whether they were successful in that, I honestly couldn't tell you, because that is ultimately down to you, and I will say whether or not I believe that was successful later on. But the fact is that a lot of people did have very high expectations for this movie, especially also considering that the LEGO movie and the LEGO Batman movie were also received extremely well. I do think it was very safe to say that there was a lot of hype around this release, and I do think a lot of people were extremely excited for it, me included, because there was a very good marketing push for this movie as well. There was a lot of tie-ins, of course there was a lot of LEGO sets, and like I said, there was also promotional media within the actual LEGO movie itself. There was a lot of trailers that really demonstrated the movie that we were going to be getting, and they did hire a celebrity cast to actually voice the ninja for it. Honestly, that was a big interesting part when it came down to it, so let's talk about that next up. Because that was possibly one of the bigger differences that a lot of people were skeptical about going in. Of course, there were other aspects, but I'll go into that in a minute. But there were a lot of changes, especially when it did come to our ninja cast. Of course, for the most part, Wu and Garmadon did look basically the same as before, but all of the ninja did go through drastic changes. Like I said, one of the main ones being that there was a celebrity voice cast. Excuse me if I do pronounce any of these names wrong, but instead of having the cast we all know and love from the show, we got Dave Franco as Lloyd, Jackie Chan as Wu, Justin Theroux as Garmadon, Zach Woods as Zane, Abby Jacobson as Nia, Kamal Nanjiani as Jay, Michael Pena as Kai, and Fred Armisen as Cole. It was a very big departure, and they definitely had different takes when it did come to the ninja cast, which is honestly fairly interesting, and I don't think it was a bad thing whatsoever. The only thing that was disappointing is that we did find out later on that the original cast weren't even asked to partake in the Ninjago movie, which I do think is a missed opportunity, but I understand why they never did it at the same time. If anything, you could look at it as almost a good thing, because depending on how you felt about Lloyd in the show at the time, the movie was the reason why Lloyd ended up getting a more deeper voice. Of course, it was to reflect the aging of Lloyd as well, but at the same time, it was definitely a reaction of the Ninjago movie. That wasn't the only change though, because they also did all go through major design differences, and those design changes are still within the show today. Of course, all of them had maybe some slight adjustments, some things here and there, but for the most part, most of them did maintain their movie designs, and it's still the designs that we get to see within Dragon's Rising. Again, the redesigns did cause a very controversial change within the Ninjago community, and I do think it's a whole different topic in of itself. I did actually make a video regarding when the Ninjago fans found out about the design changes. If you want to view that video, it is called The Day the Ninjago Community Divided, and it is on my channel. Definitely check that out if you haven't. But for the most part, it was very split down the middle on the opinion of the design changes. A lot of people believe that they should have kept the original designs, whereas a lot of people did welcome these new designs. I do think nowadays, most people are fairly content with seeing these new variants of the Ninja. Of course, there are still a lot of people who don't really care for it, but for the most part, I do think these design changes in the long run have definitely been very welcomed. And I do think it is worth it, considering that these designs are a lot more unique and a lot more stylized for our beloved cast. I do think on an overall, the fans for the most part were intrigued by these changes in design. It was fairly drastic, I will say, because at the time we did go from a cast that we all know and love to a very different outlook. So I do think a lot of people were fairly suspicious of it as that. But I do think the intrigue did give people more chance to go and view the movie. So I don't necessarily think anyone felt betrayed by this, but I definitely do think some people did. But unfortunately, I don't think for the most part, these changes were necessarily a bad thing. The last change I will definitely note is the fact that even though this movie was written by the same people who were doing the show, there were a lot of changes when it came down to the actual lore of the show. There were a lot of interesting, subtle differences, and some major differences at that. So let's actually talk about it, because for the most part, it really intertwines with the story and the themes of the movie. The core theme and the core story about this movie was always the concept of family, and more specifically, Lloyd's struggle with being the son of Lord Garmadon. And I do think the main change that we do have to note is the fact that in the show, Lloyd is more sad and upset by it, and so is Garmadon to an extent. Whereas in the movie, it's much more of an aggressive tone. They are much more angry towards each other, for good reason may I add, but instead of having Lloyd in a more sympathetic role, he is in more of an aggressive role, and I do think that's actually a good change when it comes down to it. I also do think to an extent it was honestly necessary of a change, because it's not the only theme of the movie itself. Of course, family is one, but it's also a case of identity, forgiveness, and the relationships you have with the people around you. And I don't think Lloyd could necessarily have achieved that if he was on more of a sympathetic role. I think for this movie, Garmadon had to have more of an aggressive son against him, because I don't think it would have necessarily worked otherwise. The show itself actually does cover the idea within season 2, but you see that Garmadon and Lloyd don't want to be enemies. They are sympathetic towards each other, and in the end they are rooting for each other when it comes down to the fight with the Overlord. But the thing is that with no Overlord in the Ninjago movie, I don't think they could have necessarily have achieved that story without trying to jump through some loopholes. So if you reconnect the two of them in more of a theme of anger and aggression, I do think it still works in a very similar way. So honestly, I do think it was a very welcome change to the lore itself. I do think to an extent it was a little bit underdeveloped though. I do think there were a lot of things that could have been done, some extra stuff that could have happened between scenes, but for the most part I do think they did do it quite well. There's a lot of fantastic scenes between Lloyd and Garmadon, and I definitely think they have some really good dynamics within the movie itself. Does that necessarily mean I think they should have had more? Honestly, yes, because it could have built things up on an even bigger extent and definitely had a much more of an emotional send-off, especially at the end between the two of them. Honestly, for the most part, I do think it still achieves this, but I definitely think they could have done it to a very higher level. But like I said, I don't necessarily think that's bad, and I do think for the most part, Lloyd and Garmadon in particular do have a very good arc throughout the course of the movie. The rest of the ninja are more on the arc of they're trying to be ninja and they're trying to figure out who they are. It's not to the extent of Lloyd, but ultimately they couldn't have given all of the ninja Lloyd scale arcs in this movie because it would have been officially too cluttered. And ultimately speaking, the movie is meant to be about the Garmadon family. So honestly, even though the ninja didn't get as much as Lloyd, I do still think they had a lot, and I definitely do think it translated to a very good arc for the most part. And even though they do have these really good themes and these really good arcs, does it fit the overall tone of the movie? Of course, it's a very light-hearted movie. Of course, at the end of the day, it is a kids' movie. So they do have that nice balance, I guess, when it comes to the more serious tones that they did have, along with the humor of the movie itself. There has to be a good blend of the two, and for the most part, I do think they were quite successful at that. Because even though you've got these really good emotional scenes, you do have a nice blend then with the ninja doing something silly. Honestly, Honestly, one of the things this movie does do best are the scenes where they kind of just sat around talking. One of the main scenes I think of as an example of this is the scene where the ninja are carrying Garmadon in that cage, and they're just asking him about his forearms, and there's just a very cool conversation between all of them. Honestly, if you ask me what my favorite scene of the movie was, it's probably going to be that one, because the conversation of just Garmadon's arms is really interesting, especially when you have the ninjas just feeling so casual with Garmadon. Honestly, it's a really good touch, and I do think it goes quite unappreciative when it's in the movie. Of course, apart from this though, there is a lot of humor that's quite meta. It's very slapstick. You do get a lot of martial arts kind of inspired humor, and it's definitely quite referential when it comes to the real world itself. And I don't think that's bad, because ultimately the movie itself is a story being told by Jackie Chan himself. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It just sometimes feels a little interruptive of the story itself, but I do think for the most part it's shelved when it needs to be. So I honestly think the humor did fairly well. Do I think it aged well? Kind of. I do think there's a couple jokes in there, like I said, a couple of the more meta jokes which I think is just a bit nah, but I do think for the most part the humor does kind of nail itself. But that's just kind of a compliment to the Lego movies themselves, because they are just kind of timeless. But I honestly do think that the movie itself does just do very well in the sense of humor. I don't think anything necessarily will make you cringe or anything that will make you really go downhill when you're watching it. There's nothing that will outright take you out of the movie in my opinion. But like I said, I do just think some of them just goes, it's a bit too meta for me. But that's down to my personal taste. You may like that. But for me, I do think it's okay, but I do still think the humor is overall fine. But I will say what is more than fine is the animation of the movie. It still very much holds up to this day. Of course, it is in the style of the previous movies that came before it. The only difference is that it has a lot more natural elements. There's a lot more environmental stuff that is inspired from the real world. You will find that none of the nature and none of the water, none of it at all the elemental powers for that matter, is actually Lego brick. It is all actual real world elements, which I do think is a slight downgrade, especially considering the Lego Movie in particular was pure stud bricks, so it's a bit meh in that regard, but it still does look fantastic. All of the characters still have that Lego shine to them, still have that air of scuffness like a child was playing with these minifigures, and I do think that is a very good touch, and just again something that all the movies do have, which I do think is a brilliant thing to see. Like I said, I do think the Ninjago movie could have used less natural elements. I do think it would have been cooler if we did get more brick built things, but ultimately I understand why they never did it, because I do think when they're in the jungle, if it was all brick built, I think it would have been just a little too much. But I definitely do miss the charm of the first Lego movie where everything was Lego bricks, and I do kind of wish we got to see that within this movie itself. But that is the movie when it comes to all of its core elements and talking about subjects of the movie itself. But how did it actually get received when it first released 8 years ago? Of course, there were very mixed reviews when it came down to it critically. IMDb currently sits at 6.1 out of 10, Rotten Tomatoes is currently on 56%. So it's not exactly like it's a widely positive reception, or not even negative at that. It's extremely neutral and down the middle. From what I could gather and what I can remember at the time, the casual fans did actually really like this movie. I do think a lot of people did really enjoy it. I know a lot of people, and I do think this is a very common consensus regardless, a lot of people will say that the first Lego movie is better and the Lego Batman movie is better as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad as in the Lego Ninjago movie. It just means it's the worst of a really good bunch. The main area of critique really did come from the fans of the show that came before. I do think a lot of people had problems with it because there were certain liberties that were taken that I do think a lot of people never really cared for. I know a lot of people said about how Zane was very much leaned into just being a robot, and no one really liked that, and some of the other ones just had traits that you weren't really expecting. I mean, Cole's whole thing being music, when the show never really implied that before, I do think is a bit of a meh decision, but I do think for the most part people were just complaining if it was drastic changes from the show that came before. But that is completely valid because a lot of people were hoping for something that was a bit closer to the show. An adaptation of the show itself into the movie, it would honestly have been a very cool thing to see. It's just the case of this one did just take more liberties, and I do just think a lot of people never really cared for that because of it. But I do just think that's something that comes down ultimately to personal preference. They were never going to be able to make a movie that absolutely everyone liked. I mean, the live action movie will also probably receive the exact same hate. But at the end of the day, that is just the freedom of opinion. No one will like everything because no piece of media is completely perfect. And that is just what it comes down to at the end of the day. Outside of the personal opinions of all the fans that watched the movie, did it actually perform well when it came down to it critically? More specifically, when it comes to the box office. It had a budget of $70 million, which honestly is fairly decent for an animated movie, but it had an overall gross of $123 million. So, depending on how you look at it, I mean, budget doesn't really include marketing, so it's very difficult to actually determine, but on paper, it does seem like it was for the most part a success. I definitely think they anticipated it doing better than it did, especially considering that it vastly underperformed in comparison to the other movies. So it comes down to, it did okay, but it definitely didn't do as good as they probably were hoping. Which is ultimately probably the reason why we never got a second one. Of course, they did also follow up with the Lego Movie 2, and that one also underperformed as far as I'm aware, which I do think is very interesting to note, and that did ultimately lead to the end of this Warner Bros. Lego universe. So, at the end of the day, we were never going to get an Ninjago sequel regardless. Honestly, it could have if it did better, but I guess we'll never know that. But before I move on to my final verdict when it comes to the Ninjago movie, I do want to talk about one more thing, which is the overall legacy and the impact it did have on the Ninjago community. Because it definitely did. It definitely shook Ninjago to its core and definitely still has its after effects to this very day. It didn't have as much of an impact, say, as the Lego Batman movie did, but it definitely did do what it should have done, especially within the community. I honestly do think the movie did help the brand overall. I definitely think it drove so many people to come in and watch Ninjago from then onwards. A lot of people to this day will still say that the movie is what got them into Ninjago. So for that reason, it definitely did have an impact, and the legacy will definitely be there because there will forever be a lot of Ninjago fans who will say that they watched the movie and that is how they got into the show itself. And the unspoken impact is the fact that it did alter the Ninjago show in more ways than just design. I mean, the 8th season of the show was made to tie in more to the Ninjago movie itself, not in a direct sense, but more in the sense of they brought back Garmadon because of the movie. Initially speaking, season 8 was meant to be basically Hands of Time Part 2, and it would have been a very different time considering that. We may have not even have gotten the Oni trilogy if it wasn't for the movie itself. So the impact it had outside of the community and on the show itself was massive, and I do think a lot of people don't realize that we would have had one of the most popular seasons of Ninjago if it wasn't for the movie itself. And I do think that is the biggest takeaway you could take when it comes to the movie. The fact is that the movie did pave the way for so much of what we have in Ninjago to this very day. A lot of Ninjago as it currently stands probably wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for that movie. And if you like it or if you don't, you have to acknowledge the fact that it certainly did have an impact on the show. For better or for worse, I guess that is down to you. But I do think you can't ignore the fact that the movie had such an impression when it came to Ninjago as a brand. And honestly, I do think it contributed to the success of Ninjago at an overall. But let's talk about an overall. Rewatching the movie 8 years later was honestly a very fun experience for me, and for that reason, I definitely do think to an extent the movie holds up to a rewatch to this very day. Honestly, I don't think it's just a case of nostalgia either. I think objectively speaking, even though it does have its flaws, I do think it's a very solid and a very fun movie to actually sit down and watch. Like I said, there is so much to this movie that I do think aged very well. The animation still holds up. I do think the story, the themes, and the core values of the movie itself is still very much there and present. And I do think, honestly, like I said, even if you have to ignore certain parts of the movie, the humor is still very good. It still has that Lego Movie charm that I do think a lot of people fell in love with the first movie in 2014. But as for my personal take, I definitely think, even though there are some very big flaws when it does come to this movie, I do think it's something that a lot of people should appreciate more when it comes to Ninjago. I honestly think, to an extent, it's a bit of a hidden gem. I'm not saying that in the sense of not many people know about the movie, but I'm saying that as I do hope more people will come to appreciate the movie over time. I, personally speaking, very much enjoyed it when it first came out. I then didn't really care for it for a while, but I've definitely come back to loving the movie itself. I think it's such a fun watch and definitely an essential piece of media if you are a fan of the show. It is definitely worth the rewatch. I think if you watched the movie when it first came out, maybe it's been a couple years, I definitely would recommend going back and just having fun with this movie. If you don't go in expecting something crazy, expecting something to change Ninjago as you know it, you honestly can have a very fun time. I do think if you watched at the time, you were definitely hoping, or more specifically expecting, more from the movie, and I do think that's why a lot of people never really cared for it. But I do think looking back at it as this time capsule of what was there at the time, I really do think you could have a very fun time with this movie, and I don't think you would regret spending the 1 hour and 40 minutes on it. Of course, if you compare it to the show itself, you may say it's bad, because it doesn't hold a candle to some of the best seasons of the show that we have gotten over the years. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they do fulfill two very different purposes when it comes to media. I don't watch a TV show expecting it to be the quality or holding it to the same standards of a movie. A show ultimately has more time for arcs, and more time for plots, and more time for different aspects that a movie simply cannot handle. So judging it in comparison to the show honestly doesn't really feel fair to me. Judging it as a movie, I do think it accomplishes what it went out to do. And that is why, on an overall, I think the Ninjago movie is honestly a fantastic piece of Ninjago media. I definitely think it needs more appreciation than it gets, and I think 8 years later, it definitely does hold up. And if you somehow haven't seen that movie, I wholeheartedly recommend you go out and watch it. Because if you haven't, I definitely think you are missing out on something that is just extremely fun and extremely lighthearted, and definitely something that any Ninjago fan should have seen. But what is your opinion on the Ninjago movie? Like I said, I would love to know how you feel about it, how you felt about it over the years. Did you watch it when it first came out? Did you only watch it recently? There are so many things you could talk about when it comes to the movie, and I do think considering the movie is now 8 years old, it's definitely a great time to create some discussion around it. I definitely do feel like it deserves more appreciation, and I hope that you guys do agree with me as well. But if you don't, that is more than okay. I would love to know why you don't like the movie. I would love to know what flaws it has that you feel like you can't really look over. I do want to have more discussion when it comes to the movie, because at the end of the day, I do love it for its own different reasons. But that is about it for today, you guys, and thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay, bye!